In 2023, Peter Obi won Lagos. Let that land for a second. Lagos, the commercial capital of Nigeria, the home state of the sitting APC president, a state that the ruling party had held with an iron grip for over a decade. And Obi walked in without a single governor backing him, without Atiku's structural machinery, without Kwankwaso's northern base, and he pulled votes there that no opposition candidate had pulled in a generation. Nationally, he finished with 19% of the vote. Kwankwaso took another 6%. Atiku took 29%. Now here is the number that nobody in mainstream Nigerian political media wants to sit with. Those three men, running against each other, splitting the same anti-incumbent sentiment three ways, collectively received approximately 47% of valid votes cast. Tinubu won with 36.6%. The opposition didn't lose in 2023 because Nigerians wanted Tinubu. The opposition lost because it couldn't agree on a single lane. So, while every political commentator in Nigeria is busy asking whether Tinubu can survive a second term, whether the economy recovers in time, whether his health holds, whether the APC stays together, nobody is asking the question that actually determines the outcome of 2027. And that question is this. There is a specific structural condition, one that has nothing to do with popularity polls, nothing to do with rally attendance, nothing to do with who gives the best speech, that makes an opposition coalition not just possible in 2027, but mathematically decisive. But it only works if it is assembled in a precise order. Get the order wrong, and the coalition collapses before it launches. Get it right, and the arithmetic becomes undeniable. I will come back to exactly what that condition is and exactly why the order matters more than the names. But first, everyone is arguing about who should step down. Nobody is asking who is actually negotiating right now, and through which back channels. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let me tell you what is actually happening right now, because the surface story and the real story are two very different things. On the surface, the post-2023 political landscape looks like this. Tinubu is governing. The Supreme Court has closed the door to election petitions. The APC is consolidating northern governors, and the opposition is fragmented, bitter, and leaderless. That is the narrative being pushed by APC-aligned analysts and by a media environment that mistakes noise for analysis. But underneath that surface, something else is happening. Atiku Abubakar's political machinery has gone unusually quiet since the Supreme Court's final ruling. No major policy statements, no aggressive public opposition messaging, no declaration for or against 2027. And yet, and this is the part that is not being reported, his closest political allies are actively meeting with people inside Peter Obi's in-Labour Party inner circle. Separately, there are contacts being made with Kwankwaso's NNPP structure. These are not courtesy visits. These are exploratory negotiations. This is not retirement. This is positioning. Now, why is it happening now and not later? Because the people around these three principles understand something that the public conversation has not yet absorbed. The structural decisions that will determine who wins 2027 are not made during the campaign. They are made 2 and 3 years before the campaign. The party primary timelines, the voter registration windows, the merger and alliance registration requirements with INEC, all of it front-loads the real decision-making into 2024 and 2025. By the time Nigerians are watching campaign rallies in 2026, the contest will already be structurally decided. That is the buried narrative, and it connects directly to a pattern that Nigerian political history has already demonstrated once, clearly, decisively, and in a way that should be impossible to ignore. The only time in the history of Nigeria's Fourth Republic that an incumbent ruling party lost a presidential election was 2015. And it did not happen because Jonathan was unpopular, though he was. It happened because in 2013, the ACN, the CPG, the ANPP, and a faction of the PDP sat in a room and agreed to become one party before the campaign started. The APC merger was not an ideological project, it was a mathematical one. Buhari had lost 3 times as a fragmented opposition candidate. The merger made him a first-time coalition candidate, and he won. That is the historical context, sharp, relevant, and directly applicable to 2027. Now, here's the fact that reframes this entire situation differently from how it has been reported. The 2023 election was not a Tinubu victory in any meaningful political sense. It was a suppressed opposition tie. Tinubu did not win a majority. He didn't even win a plurality against a unified opponent. He won because 3 opposition candidates who collectively represented a larger share of the Nigerian electorate than he did refused to coordinate. The question for 2027 is not whether public sentiment has shifted against the incumbent. Economic data shows it has shifted further against him, not less. The question is whether the opposition has absorbed the 2015 lesson or whether it's about to repeat the 2023 mistake. To understand why this coalition question is harder than it looks, you have to understand the institutional terrain it has to navigate. Because this is not just a political negotiation. It is a legal and constitutional challenge, and the law in several key places is deliberately ambiguous in ways that benefit whoever is already in power. Let us start with the institutions directly in play. INEC is the first. The Independent National Electoral Commission controls the party registration framework, the alliance and merger rules, and the operational mechanics of how results are transmitted, collated, and certified. The second is the judiciary, specifically the Supreme Court, whose 2023 ruling on the presidential election petition established interpretative precedents around the 25% in 2/3 of states clause under Section 134 of the 99 Constitution. The third is the National Assembly, whose composition affects committee control, legislative oversight of INEC, and the confirmation dynamics for key federal appointments. And behind all 3 of those, the executive, which holds the appointment power that feeds into the other institutions in ways that are not always visible on the surface. Let us deal with Section 134 first, because it's the constitutional clause that makes northern vote concentration existentially important to any presidential bid. To win the Nigerian presidency, you don't just need the most votes nationally. You need to clear 25% of valid votes in at least 24 of Nigeria's 36 states. That requirement is why Kwankwaso's vote in 2023 concentrated so heavily in Kano, where he pulled over 1.5 million votes, matters strategically beyond its raw national percentage. He didn't just win Kano. He demonstrated organizational control of a vote concentration that any presidential coalition needs to account for. You can't build the 24-state map without the North, and you can't build the North without anchoring in Kano. Now, on the merger and alliance question, and this is where the legal ambiguity becomes strategically dangerous. INEC's regulations on inter-party alliances versus formal mergers have been inconsistently applied across election cycles. Here's the specific problem. A coalition of opposition parties that does not formally complete a legal merger before the candidate nomination window opens is exposed to ballot recognition challenges. If Atiku endorses Obi, or if Labour Party structurally absorbs Kwankwaso's NNPP delegates, but the paperwork and procedural requirements for a recognized merger are not complete, that arrangement can be challenged in court, and the APC, with its legal machinery and its access to federal judicial appointments, knows exactly how to trigger those challenges at the moment of maximum disruption. Has this kind of institutional maneuver been used before? Yes. In 2019, PDP's pre-election legal strategies were repeatedly neutralized, not always through overt judicial partisanship, but through narrow procedural rulings that found technical deficiencies in opposition filings at critical moments. The judiciary was not openly biased, but it consistently applied the strictest procedural standard to opposition submissions and the most flexible interpretative standard to ruling party submissions. That asymmetry is not accidental, it's a pattern. On paper, INEC is independent and the judiciary is impartial. In practice, both institutions carry the fingerprint of executive appointment power. The INEC chairman is appointed by the president, subject to Senate confirmation, a Senate that the ruling party controls. Supreme Court justices are appointed through the same executive-legislative pipeline. The reform rhetoric that surrounded the 2022 Electoral Act did not change the fundamental structure of who appoints who. It changed some procedures. It did not change the power architecture. Now, there's one specific mechanism inside INEC's operational framework that keeps appearing in every serious post-2023 legal analysis, and I want to flag it here because it will matter enormously in 2027. It's the electronic transmission protocol for results and the evidentiary standard applied at the tribunal level to server-based result data versus paper collation forms. Who controls access to that data and under what legal standard a court will accept it as evidence determines whether a close election can be successfully contested or not. That question, who controls that access in 2027, connects directly to an appointment window that opens before the next election. I will come back to exactly what that means. Now, let us get into the strategy. Because the institutional terrain is the board, but the players are the ones making the moves. And every principal in this situation is operating from a different set of interests, a different set of risks, and a different calculation about what 2027 is actually worth to them. Start with Tinubu. His strategic interest is simple. He needs the opposition to fragment again. He doesn't need a mandate. He doesn't need popularity. He needs 37% and enough geographical distribution to clear 25% in 24 states. If Obi, Kwankwaso, and Atiku are each running their own presidential campaigns in 2027, Tinubu wins by default. The same arithmetic as 2023, with a different winner in name, but the same structural result. His entire 2027 strategy is built around one objective: making sure the coalition does not form cleanly. Now look at Atiku. His calculation is more complex and more personally urgent. He will be 76 years old on election day in 2027. This would be his 6th presidential run. Another loss, particularly a loss where he ran and came 3rd or 4th, removes him permanently from serious political conversation. But there's something that matters more to Atiku at this point, and that is the infrastructure of influence he has built since 1999. The PDP Northern Governors Network, the Dan Hausa business relationships, the patronage architecture that flows through the party machinery he has cultivated for 25 years. His calculation in 2027 is not primarily, can I win? His calculation is, what arrangement best preserves my influence over that infrastructure, regardless of who sits in Aso Rock? If he endorses Obi and Obi wins, Atiku becomes a kingmaker. And kingmakers in Nigerian politics extract real structural rewards. If he endorses Obi and Obi loses, Atiku takes credit for the attempt without bearing the cost of another personal defeat. The only scenario that is genuinely bad for Atiku is running himself and losing again, which is why his incentive to step aside and back a coalition is actually stronger than his stated position currently suggests. Now look at Kwankwaso. And this is where people fundamentally misread the situation. Kwankwaso is not a spoiler. He is a structural negotiator. His value is surgical and geographical, not national. He demonstrated in 2023 that he can deliver Kano at a scale that no other opposition candidate can match. Kano is Nigeria's highest single-state vote concentration outside Lagos. Any presidential candidate who absorbs Kwankwaso's organizational machine in Kano and extends it into Katsina and Jigawa, where his networks have roots, gains a structural advantage in the north that Tinubu cannot easily counter, even with APC governors in those states, because governor loyalty in the northwest is transactional, not ideological. Governors deliver when they believe the winning side has been correctly identified. They do not deliver out of party affiliation alone. Kwankwaso's price will not be symbolic. It will be structural. A vice presidential slot, or a specific cluster of federal ministries, or a formal legislative leadership arrangement. He is negotiating leverage, and his leverage is maximum as long as his position remains publicly ambiguous. The moment he publicly commits, his price drops. He knows this, which is why he will be the last to move publicly, even if he is the first to move privately. Now look at Peter Obi. His coalition position is the most interesting because his base is the most different from the other three. He didn't win in 2023 because of governors. He didn't win because of traditional institutions or ethnic bloc voting. He won among urban youth, among Igbo diaspora, among anti-establishment middle-class voters in Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, and secondary cities who had never been motivated by any previous presidential candidate. That base does not transfer through an endorsement. If Atiku says vote for candidate X, his voters transfer organizationally, through the ward structures and local government machinery that respond to PDP instructions. But if Obi says vote for candidate X, his voters think for themselves. The Obi vote is ideological, not organizational. It follows the person, not the instruction. Which means any coalition that does not place Obi at the top of the ticket risks losing the demographic that made 2023 genuinely competitive. Now, the 2027 electoral geography. In 2023, Obi cleared 25% in 12 states, concentrated in the southeast, parts of the south-south, and urban centers. Atiku cleared 25% in 12 states, mostly different ones, concentrated in the northwest, northeast, and parts of the middle belt. The overlap is imperfect, but the states where both candidates crossed 25%, Benue, Plateau, and parts of the south-south, are exactly the states where Tinubu is most vulnerable and where a combined organizational effort would be most decisive. The silent stakeholders are Southeast governors. Not a single one has declared for any opposition figure. That silence is not neutrality, it is negotiation. Whoever makes the most credible offer of genuine federal intrusion, and I mean ministerial appointments, infrastructure commitments, and security cooperation in the Southeast, not symbolic gestures, will get their quiet organizational support. The same calculation applies to Edo and Delta, where post-governorship realignments are still unsettled. Follow the money. Atiku's financial infrastructure, built over 25 years across logistics, real estate, and party campaign fund management, gives him the capacity to underwrite a coalition operation that neither Obi nor Kwankwaso can independently sustain. Campaign finance in Nigerian elections is not transparent, but the gap between INEC's official declaration requirements and what competitive presidential mobilization at the ward level actually costs is enormous. That gap is filled by principals like Atiku, which means his financial role in a coalition does not require him to be the candidate. It requires him to be the financer, and financiers in Nigerian presidential politics extract their own form of structural reward. But here's what almost nobody has connected yet, and it changes the entire picture. The coalition math works on paper, the geographic arithmetic is viable, the money infrastructure exists, the historical precedent has already been demonstrated, and yet every previous opposition coalition attempt in Nigeria's Fourth Republic has collapsed at exactly the same structural fault line. Not ethnicity, not ideology, not money, but the question of who controls the party machinery after the deal is announced, who holds the national chairmanship, who controls the nominations process at the state level, who decides the senatorial and gubernatorial candidates in the 2027 cycle. That question has destroyed more Nigerian opposition alliances than any external pressure ever has, and it is the question that the current back-channel conversations have not yet resolved.
Let us step back from the individual players and look at what this actually means for Nigeria. Because this is not just a story about three politicians deciding who gets the ticket. The structural outcome of 2027 has consequences that extend far beyond Aso Rock. On the question of Nigeria's federal balance, a Tinubu second term, following the pattern established since 2015, consolidates a specific regional power arrangement: Southwest Presidency, Northern Legislative Leadership, and Southeast political marginalization. That arrangement is not constitutionally prohibited, but it accelerates centrifugal pressure on the federal structure that has been building for years. The 2014 National Conference recommendations on resource control, on devolution of power, on restructuring were shelved after Jonathan left office. If 2027 produces the same regional distribution of federal power for the third consecutive election cycle, the restructuring conversation stops being a political talking point and becomes a structural demand. The governors and legislators who are currently managing that pressure within the system will face constituents who have run out of patience with the management approach. On the economic consequences for ordinary Nigerians, the 2023 election will be fought in the shadow of a cost of living crisis that has not resolved. The 2023 subsidy removal produced a shock to household purchasing power that the median Nigerian, the market trader in Kano, the transport worker in Lagos, the smallholder farmer in Benue, has not recovered from. Inflation, exchange rate instability, and the collapse of formal employment in manufacturing are not abstractions. They are the daily experience of the voter, whose decision in 2027 will be made based on whether their life is better or worse than it was 4 years earlier. That is the ground on which this election will actually be decided, and it is the ground on which Tinubu is currently most exposed. On security, a prolonged competitive campaign, particularly one with strong ethnic and regional mobilization in contested zones, creates operational space for non-state actors. The pattern from 2011, 2015, and 2019 is documented. Election cycles correlate with intensified security incidents in the Northwest and Northeast. A coalition campaign that draws Kwankwaso's days into high-intensity political activity in Kano creates both an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity is that organized political engagement can crowd out the space that extremist recruitment fills in communities with high youth unemployment. The risk is that security force deployment in those zones during a competitive campaign can be and has historically been politically directed rather than threat-driven. Now, that INEC electronic transmission mechanism I flagged earlier, the one controlling evidentiary access to server-level result data at the tribunal level, here is exactly what it means in a 2027 context. If an opposition coalition wins the popular vote and the result is then contested through collation-level discrepancies in specific states, the evidentiary standard that the election tribunal applies to digital server data versus paper collation forms determines whether a legitimate win can be certified or reversed on procedural grounds. That standard is not set by the Constitution. It is set in practice by the judicial culture of the INEC and appointment history of the sitting tribunal judges and INEC chairman's operational decisions about data access. That is not a minor administrative decision. That is a structural determinant of the election outcome. Here is the data point that reframes the national stakes in a way that most of this conversation has missed. In the 14 states where Tinubu's 2023 margin of victory was under 5 percentage points, his advantage came from two specific sources: state-level incumbent machinery and suppressed opposition voter turnout in urban local government, not from overwhelming popular support. Both of those factors are directly addressable. Turnout suppression is harder to sustain when the opposition has a unified, well-funded, coordinated get-out-of-the-vote operation with a single name on the form. State machinery loyalty shifts when governors begin to calculate that the federal patronage calculation has changed and backing the incumbent is no longer the safe bet. Tinubu is not politically invulnerable. He is dependent on conditions he doesn't fully control, and both of those conditions are moving.
The international dimension of this story is real, but it has to be understood correctly because it is easy to overstate foreign influence on Nigerian elections and equally easy to miss the ways it operates at the margin. Start with the United States. After ECOWAS's handling of the Niger and Burkina Faso coups, Washington's strategic attention to West African democratic stability has intensified significantly. Nigeria is the anchor of the region. A 2027 electoral process that is perceived internationally as compromised, whether through result manipulation, opposition coalition suppression, or post-election legal crisis that drags for months, would trigger a materially different American response than the Biden administration's relatively muted reaction to 2023. The Biden calculation was deliberate.
preserve the Nigerian security and counter-terrorism partnership at the cost of softer electoral integrity messaging. A different American administration calculates differently, and regardless of who sits in the White House, the U.S. Congress, through its Africa subcommittees and its human rights certification requirements for security assistance, has mechanisms to apply pressure that do not require White House approval. The UK's position is shaped by the large and politically engaged British Nigerian diaspora, disproportionately professional, economically active, and connected to Labour Party networks in Nigeria. Their capacity to sustain international pressure on electoral integrity is real, but it is bounded by the UK's own Nigeria policy priorities, which are currently dominated by migration management and post-Brexit trade relationships. The diaspora's most effective lever is not international pressure, it is direct financial and organizational support for domestic civil society and voter mobilization infrastructure, not on international pressure campaigns, which are real but secondary. What I'm about to show you in the next part of this analysis is where this story becomes truly dangerous. Not in a rhetorical sense, but in the specific sense that the strongest argument being made for why Tinubu cannot be beaten in 2027 is the argument that most systematically misleads Nigerians about what actually winning in 2027 requires. Let me give the strongest possible argument that Tinubu's 2027 re-election is structurally guaranteed, because that argument deserves to be taken seriously and then dismantled precisely. The argument goes like this. Incumbency in Nigeria is not just a political advantage. It is a structural one that polls cannot measure. Federal character appointments, Security Force Administration Authority, INEC administrative discretion, state-level governor alignment, local government chairman networks, and financial capacity to move resources into contested zones in the weeks before Election Day. These are tools that no opposition candidate has ever successfully countered in a first-term re-election bid in the Fourth Republic. The 2015 exception involved a second-term incumbent whose mandate was visibly collapsed, whose economy had crashed with oil prices, and whose handling of the Boko Haram crisis was a national embarrassment. Tinubu is a first-term incumbent with a functioning state apparatus, significant northern governor support, and a ruling party with 22 governorships. That is the structural argument for his durability. It is not propaganda. It is the historically accurate baseline. And it is specifically true about the governors. In 2023, Tinubu had 22 APC governors deploying state machinery, local government chairmen, ward coordinators, result handling officials at the collation level. That is an organizational infrastructure that no coalition of 3 opposition parties assembled in a hurry can replicate from scratch. Even if Atiku, Obi, and Kwankwaso unify perfectly, they are combining party structures that are, at the sub-federal level, significantly weaker than the APCs in most of the country. That is the strongest version of the incumbency argument. Now, here is why it is incomplete. It assumes governor loyalty is stable. It is not. APC governors operate on a transactional logic. Federal allocation flows, security cooperation, and successor grooming are the actual currencies of their loyalty. Tinubu's first-term record on each of those fronts has produced visible fractures. At least 4 APC governors, and I am being conservative, have sent signals through intermediaries that their 2027 commitment is conditional on deliverables that have not materialized. That is not an open rebellion, but it is not unconditional loyalty either. And in Nigerian politics, conditional loyalty has a market price, which means it is available to the highest structural bidder before the campaign formally begins. Now, let me address the 3 biggest misconceptions that are distorting this conversation. The first misconception is that if Atiku endorses Obi, Atiku's voters automatically follow. They don't.
This is perhaps the most dangerous assumption in the current opposition calculus. Northern Muslim PDP voters do not transfer tribally or personally. They transfer organizationally through mosques, through traditional institutions, and ward-level PDP machinery that responds to instructions from people they trust in their own communities. An Atiku endorsement buys Obi access to that organizational machinery. It does not buy the votes. The campaign still has to be run ward by ward with candidates and messengers that Northern Muslim voters find credible. If the Labour Party does not have that local infrastructure, and in large parts of the Northwest it currently does not, the endorsement is a press release, not a vote transfer. The second misconception is that Kwankwaso is a spoiler who can be managed or bypassed. He is not. A spoiler is someone whose removal from the equation costs you nothing. Kwankwaso's removal from the opposition equation costs the coalition Kano and potentially the entire Northwest organizational anchor. He is a structural negotiator with a specific asset to offer, a specific price in mind, and the leverage to walk to the other side if the offer is insufficient. Treating him as a vanity candidate who will eventually fall into line is the exact mistake that will hand his Kano network to the APC. And the third misconception is that 2027 is still far away and these decisions can wait. They cannot. The decisions being made right now in meetings that are not being covered through intermediaries whose names are not in the newspapers are the decisions that will determine whether the coalition is structurally possible. INEC's voter registration windows, party primary timelines, and the PDP national convention cycle and the merger registration requirements front-load the real decision-making into 2024 and 2025. By 2026, the public campaign begins, but the structural architecture will already be fixed. You cannot build a functional coalition during a campaign. You build it before one starts. And here is the piece of evidence that both sides of this argument have almost entirely missed. The 2027 contest will not ultimately be decided by who wins the coalition negotiation. It will be decided by whether the winner of that negotiation can build a parallel get-out-the-vote infrastructure in the 14 most competitive states before the APC's incumbency machinery fully activates. Coalition agreements are announcements. Elections are logistics. Nigeria's Fourth Republic has one consistent empirical truth running through every result since 1999. The organization that can reliably move people to polling units in Nasarawa, Benue, and Plateau on election day, in the rain, at 7 a.m., in areas where INEC ad hoc staff have historically been susceptible to pressure, wins those states. That is not a money question alone, that is a time and structure question, and the clock on that question is already running. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Let me now walk you through the 3 most likely next moves and then tell you exactly what to watch for, because the signals will come before the announcements. The first move to watch for is Atiku signaling his exit, but not through a press conference, through a surrogate. Expect a formal or semi-formal statement, possibly framed as a Chatham House-style policy address or a statement through a senior PDP figure, in which Atiku's position shifts from "I am considering 2027" to "My role in 2027 is to ensure opposition unity." That is the political language for "I am stepping aside if the terms are right." When that statement comes, and based on the back-channel activity currently underway, it is a question of timing, not if. Watch which Labour Party or NNPP figure responds publicly within 72 hours. Not 72 hours later with a press release, within 72 hours organically. That response will tell you whether a back-channel agreement has already been reached. A quick, warm, coordinated-sounding response means the deal is done. Silence or cautious response means the negotiation is still open. Either way, the footprint movement is the signal, not the words. The second move is Kwankwaso, and this one will not be visible on the surface at all. His tell is not a statement. His tell is organizational expansion. Watch whether the NNPP begins to build ward-level structures outside Kano, specifically in Jigawa, Katsina, and Zamfara. If his party is quietly expanding its footprint beyond its existing base, it means he's preparing to be a coalition asset worth paying for. He's building leverage by demonstrating that his organizational value extends beyond the one state everyone already knows he controls. If his structures contract or stagnate outside Kano, it means he has already cut a private deal, possibly with the APC, or he's waiting for a direct offer that has not yet been made. Either way, the footprint movement is the signal, not the words. The third move is Tinubu, and this one will already be beginning. The APC will not wait for the opposition to consolidate before responding. Expect a series of targeted federal announcements between now and 2026. Infrastructure project launches, security operation declarations, and federal appointment clusters deliberately concentrated in the 12 states where the 2023 margin was thinnest. Benue, Nasarawa, Plateau, Edo, and Delta are the specific states to watch. Federal presence in those states, in the form of visible spending, security deployment, and political appointments, will be disproportionate to their size and needs. This is not governance, this is pre-positioning, and it's the move that a well-organized opposition coalition needs to be building a counter-narrative to right now, not in 2026. What does escalation look like? If the coalition negotiations collapse publicly through a leaked fallout between Atiku and Obi camps, through competing LP and PDP primary declarations, through Kwankwaso cutting a separate deal with the APC, the path to 2027 becomes a replay of 2023. The APC will not even need to campaign aggressively. It will simply need to let the opposition fragment and then manage the coalition process. That scenario is not hypothetical. It is the default outcome if no one does the hard structural work. What does de-escalation require? It requires one thing that has never been achieved in Nigerian opposition politics before a primary: a private, binding pre-primary agreement on candidacy, running mate selection, and post-election cabinet architecture signed by all three principals before any of them enter a party primary. The 2015 APC merger worked, the only time this has worked in Fourth Republic history, because the deal was done before the public campaign. The candidate was not decided by a primary, the candidate was decided by a negotiation, and the primary ratified what was already agreed. Any opposition arrangement that waits for the primaries to play out before resolving the top-of-ticket question will collapse. The primaries create competing winners with competing mandates, competing donor networks, and competing state-level factional obligations. By the time someone steps down after a primary loss, the machine that was built for them has already been promised to too many people to be transferred cleanly. Now, that structural condition I opened this analysis with, that specific sequencing question, why the order matters more than the names, here is the answer. The coalition must be assembled, Kwankwaso first, Atiku second, Obi third, and here's why. Kwankwaso's leverage is at its maximum right now, when both the APC and the opposition are still courting him. The moment Atiku publicly announces he's stepping aside and backing the coalition, the APC will move aggressively to offer Kwankwaso a direct deal, because absorbing Kano back into the APC column is the single most cost-effective move available to Tinubu strategists. If Kwankwaso has not already been structurally committed to the coalition before Atiku's exit is announced, he becomes available to the highest bidder in the window between Atiku's announcement and the coalition's formal structure being locked. That window is where coalitions die.
So, Kwankwaso must be privately secured, his organizational machine committed, his price agreed, his role defined before Atiku moves publicly. Then, Atiku's exit, framed correctly, becomes a momentum event that accelerates the coalition rather than opening a bidding war. And Obi, already positioned as the candidate with the broadest demographic range and the strongest anti-incumbent credibility, becomes the natural convergence point that the announcement confirms rather than creates. Get the order wrong, Atiku exits first, Kwankwaso remains uncommitted, Obi announces, and Tinubu's team has a clear target and a spoiler available. Get it right, and by the time the APC realizes what has happened, the structural architecture is already locked. If this trajectory continues without that assembly, if 2027 produces another fragmented opposition and another incumbency-managed result, Nigeria enters the 2030s with its federal opposition capacity structurally weakened to the point where competitive presidential politics becomes a performance rather than a genuine alternation of power. That's not a partisan observation, it's a democratic systems diagnosis, and it's the trajectory that every serious Nigerian institution, every credible civil society actor, and every international observer with a genuine stake in this country's stability should be watching and saying out loud.
Let us come back to where we started. The question was not whether Tinubu can be defeated. The question was whether three opposition politicians who collectively outpolled him, who together represented a larger share of the Nigerian electorate than he did, can stop competing against each other long enough to build the machine that makes his defeat not just possible, but arithmetically unavoidable. The analysis points to one conclusion. The capability exists, the vote share exists, the historical precedent exists, the geographical complementarity exists, the financial infrastructure exists. What has not been demonstrated is the discipline to assemble it correctly, to lock Kwankwaso privately before Atiku moves publicly, to frame Atiku's exit as a momentum event rather than a vacancy, and to position Obi as the convergence point that the arrangement confirms. That discipline has never been demonstrated in Nigerian Fourth Republic opposition politics. The 2015 merger is the closest analog, but that was a ruling party in crisis merging with an opposition, not three opposition principals agreeing to unified candidacy against a functional incumbent. The facts are the facts. Nigeria's 2027 election is not decided. It is being decided now, in conversations that are not being reported, through intermediaries whose names are not being published, on a timeline that most political commentators are not tracking carefully enough. One question for the comments, and I want a serious answer. If Atiku publicly endorses Peter Obi tomorrow, not a hint, not a signal, a full public endorsement, does Kwankwaso join the coalition or does he go to the APC? And whatever your answer is, ask yourself what it tells you about the actual limits of opposition politics in Nigeria. Drop it below. I read every comment. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.